Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing this portrait of Brad Pitt in colored pencil on sanded paper. And if you want to see longer videos and more content, you should check out my Patreon. The reference is going to be in the description if you want to check that out. It's from the movie Meet Joe Black, I believe. The pencils I'm using are Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, and the paper is a 1000 grit sandpaper. Now, as for that piece of paper on the left, that's just a smaller piece of sandpaper that I use to experiment with some colors. As for the sketch, the initial sketch, I obtained that by using a combination of tracing and freehand. Now, because this paper is not transparent, I used charcoal powder as a transfer material. And once I obtained a rudimentary sketch, I simply did a more detailed sketch using freehand, and now I'm going over some of those lines using some of my darker pencils like black and brown, and after that I'm going to do a little bit more work on the background. The background here is going to be a bit darker. There are going to be some darker, warmer tones overall in this drawing, mostly some brownish and reddish tones. And I'm going to start with burnt sienna here at the top, which is like a reddish brown, and I'm going to combine that with some black here at the bottom, closer to his shoulders. I want to create a darker out of focus background with just some blurry suggestions of shapes in the back, nothing specific. But I'm going to want to stay consistent with that overall lighting and those colors, that atmosphere. So like I said, I'm going to be using a lot of those brownish and reddish tones. Now for blending, as you will see once I put down these colors, for blending I will use brushes. I use different kinds of brushes. I like to use a combination of some softer and some harder bristle brushes. But in addition to that, I can also use some tortillons and blending stumps and even my fingers. And now I'm starting with the blending here, and while I blend you will see that some of those areas will start to become a little bit dull, and when that happens I will simply add some of the stronger, more saturated colors, like for example more of that burnt sienna or even some sanguine color, and maybe even some cadmium red here and there, just so that I would have a little bit stronger, more saturated tones, so that it's not completely dull, because I'm going to have those same tones on his face. Here I even added a touch of this cadmium red. So right now I'm happy with the way the background is going, and one of the main reasons why I would want such a dark background, and one of the main advantages here with this dark background, is the fact that he has very light hair. Here he has blonde hair, and I will use that darker background for the contrast, which will allow my main subject to stand out even better against that darker background. Now, I talked a little bit about the blending methods, and right now, if you haven't worked on sanded paper, you're probably confused, because normally these are not some of the things that you can do with colored pencils, or at least you can't do that without solvents. But here on sanded paper, because this surface is really rough and textured, you can actually move the pigment more easily, and the colored pencils behave a little bit more like pastel pencils. As for the hair, here I started first by putting down some of the darker bits, like for example on the parting and on the side of the head, and then I used some of the mid-tones in between. I used again some of that burnt sienna and some raw umber. Now, getting the right color of the hair is not always easy. Like I said, his hair is blonde, but you can't just use a yellow color. You have to use a combination of colors, and I started with some of those reddish and brownish tones, and then I used some raw umber, which has a little bit more of the yellow and green component in it. And then on top of all of that, for the lightest bits, for the highlights, I used an ivory colored pencil. The ivory colored pencil is almost white. It's a very light colored pencil, but it's just a little bit darker than white, and it's also a bit more yellowish. So that's what I want here, but I have to use it kind of sparingly on top of these darker colors because if I overdo it, the colors will just, this ivory colored pencil will just appear white against that darker background. So I have to use it sparingly, and I have to try to create a nice range of value where that middle part of the hair is lighter, and those the part of the hair near the side of the head and at the parting is a little bit darker. So I'm just trying to use that range of value to create a natural looking shape. Now here on the face, I'm going to start with some slightly crazy, warmer, more reddish colors. This is a sanguine colored pencil, and I'm going to use that as my base tone, if you will, and then I'm going to work on top of that with some lighter colors. I used some cinnamon on top of that, and then on top of that I'm going to use some even lighter colors, like light beige red. Now this cinnamon is kind of like a medium flesh color, and the light beige red is even lighter than that. I added a touch of ochre as well. I did a bit of blending with a brush, and then once I finished with most of the forehead, I was finally free to do the bangs, because I needed a darker background to do those bangs. I didn't want to put them in first, and that way they will simply stand out against the rest of the forehead a little bit better, because you always need that contrast in order for those areas of lighter value to stand out. Yeah, you need something darker behind them that they can stand out against. And here, once I put down some lighter colors, I try to blend them in with the rest of the hair, and then put some touches of darker color in between them to make it look like there's a little bit of shadow under them, and to create more depth in the hair, to make it look like the hair is sitting on top of the forehead. So with hair you can't just draw lines, you have to create that feeling of depth. You have to try to find a way to make the hair look more three-dimensional. And one of the things that makes it easier on this surface is the fact that you can go from dark to light, and the fact that you can build multiple layers, that you can layer those lighter marks on top of the darker ones. So if I put down those darker colors first when I draw hair, I can put those highlights in later, and then it looks like those lighter hairs are sitting on top of the darker ones which are in the shadow, and that makes the hair look more layered and more three-dimensional and more realistic overall. So now I'm working on the eye, and I put in the catchlight first using a white colored pencil, and the rest of the eyeball is also going to be a bit lighter, but I can't make it completely white. And the reason why I can't make it completely white is because I need the catchlight to stand out, and if I want it to stand out, everything around it needs to be darker than the catchlight itself. Now another reason why I put in the catchlight first using the white colored pencil is because even though you can put lighter details on top of the darker ones here on this surface, sometimes the layer underneath would influence the color you put on top, and maybe that white wouldn't be quite as bright as I want it to be, and that's why I think it was a good idea to put in the catchlight first. You won't always be able to do that. Like for example with the hair, I had to pull some of those highlights later once I put down some of the darker areas first. But as you can see, that's usually not a problem because this surface can take multiple layers and you can easily put lighter details on top of the darker ones. Now I should probably say a few words about shading, as I'm now shading the larger portions of the face. My approach generally is to put in the darker areas first and then work on top of that with slightly lighter colors, going lighter and lighter towards those highlights. So I start by using some browns and that sanguine, which is kind of like a reddish color, reddish dull orange maybe. And then on top of that I use those flash tones like cinnamon and light beige red. And that way I can control how dark certain parts of the face can remain and how light I want others to become. So for example, if I start with a slightly darker tone on the side of the face, on the left, I can build up that lighter tone gradually, and I can decide, as I go along, I can decide where I want to leave those areas of darker value and where I want to create areas of lighter value. So because his cheekbones stand out, naturally I'm going to want those to appear lighter and I'm going to add a bit more value there. So that's generally how I approach this process. Now as for the mechanics themselves, I use a variety of different strokes, but when in doubt you should always try to use a tapered stroke because that allows you to build layers of colors and tones very gradually. Here on this surface you can build multiple layers, but you should try to avoid pressing too hard because that will saturate the surface and that'll make it difficult for you to put new layers on top of the ones you've already put down. As you can see, I've moved on to the clothes and now I'm working on the shirt. And I also did his jacket on the left. Now if you're wondering why I simply switched to drawing the clothes even though I haven't done half the face, I guess it's just fatigue. Sometimes I do that because now I'm moving on to the other eye, as you can see, but sometimes I just because drawing portraits is kind of intense and a little bit exhausting because you have to be very careful about every single detail. You have to be careful about the proportions, about the textures and the values and things like that. You get tired pretty quickly when you draw portraits. So sometimes in order to get things moving, I just move on to a different part of my drawing. So for example, I can do a little bit more of the hair or a little bit more of the clothes or a little bit more of the background, and then go back to drawing the face once I've rested a little bit, if that makes sense. Anyway, I did the other eye, as you can see, and here in this eye on the right we have a little bit stronger catchlight, a little bit larger. That is not at all uncommon. Sometimes one eye will have brighter or a larger highlight than the other. One of the things that I like to do, and you can do that even if that's not the case in your reference photo, you can move the highlight or the catchlight a little bit further to one side so that it doesn't cover the pupil. You want to have that pupil because you want to capture that contrast between the pupil and the iris, as well as the contrast between the pupil and the catchlight. So if you find that in your reference photo the catchlight covers much of the pupil, maybe you should move it to the side a little bit, or maybe reduce its size, or maybe simplify it a little bit, because sometimes these catchlights, these reflections can be a little bit too complex and maybe difficult to explain to the viewer. So sometimes maybe it's a good idea to simplify them, make them smaller, and maybe move them around ever so slightly. So moving on with the nose. Now the nose is a very three-dimensional part of the face. And you need to find a way to create the illusion for the viewer that it's popping out or protruding towards the viewer. And in order to do that, in order to achieve that three-dimensional appearance, what you want to do is have a nice range of values so that the sides are darker than the middle part of the nose. And if you do it properly, the nose will appear three-dimensional and it won't look flat, because sometimes if you don't shade the sides sufficiently, the nose can appear too wide or too flat. Moving on to the lips now, and for a while there he looked like he was wearing some lipstick, but I'm fixing that now because I'm going to be shading and working all around it, and once that area of darker value starts to interact with the colors that I'm going to put around it, it's not going to appear quite as dark. But this right side of the face, or his left side of the face, is going to appear a bit lighter than the one on the left because it's closer to the light source. As you can see, the light source is coming from above and a little bit more from the right. So this right side of the face, our right, is going to appear a little bit lighter. That part of the nose, the tip of the nose to the right, is also a bit lighter, and of course the catch light in the eye is moved slightly to the right. Now I'm working on the chin area and this right side of the face, trying to define the topography of the face, trying to figure out how I can best explain the shape of Brad Pitt's face, his cheekbones, and his mouth, which probably is the part of the face which gave me the largest amount of trouble for some reason. Anyway, occasionally I just go back in and put some warmer tones like this cadmium orange. I felt that once I did a bit of blending, a little bit too much of the background color of my paper was revealed, and the face ended up looking a little bit kind of grayish. So I went in there with some warmer tones to make it look a little bit more alive. That's one of the things that, one of the disadvantages when you're using regular sandpaper like me. There's a limited range of colors. They're usually kind of grayish, and that influences the colors that you put on top. So that's something to keep in mind. If you want to go over that color thoroughly, you have to shade quite a bit, and you have to make sure that very little of that grayish background is coming through. But sometimes you have to do a bit of blending, and when you do blend, sometimes a little bit of that background color breaks through, and then you have to use some warmer colors on top in order to restore a more realistic and lively appearance or a face if you're doing a portrait. Now naturally, if you're doing a portrait and you already have some cooler colors, like a cooler setting, cooler lighting, then you can use that cooler background color to your advantage, but that's not really the case here. Here I have slightly different colors that I want to achieve on the face, so I have to use multiple layers, and I have to use a lot of those let's say brownish, reddish and pinkish colors so that I can achieve a natural and realistic looking skin tone. As you can see, much of this process, once I put in some of the main parts of the face, much of this process is just refining some of the details and refining the overall shape of the face, trying to figure out how I can get his mouth to look exactly the way it's supposed to, the exact shape of the eyes, the shape of that jaw. Like for example, I realized that on the left side his cheeks appeared a little bit sunken, and I needed to make them pop out a little bit more because Brad Pitt has a really strong jaw. So I had to go back in with some lighter colors. Anyway, as you can see, I started work on the right side of the hair, putting down some of the darker bits first, and then going back in with that raw umber, which is kind of like a yellowish, a lighter brown, which works well as a base color. Now I can put in some more reddish tones to stay consistent with the overall lighting in my scene, and then of course on top of that I put in those highlights using the ivory colored pencil that I used on the top of the head as well, and that really makes the hair appear more shiny and glossy and makes the top of the head appear more round and three-dimensional. So I largely finished the part of the background on the right, and now I'm still mainly refining the face by making some smaller adjustments around the mouth, the shape of the jaw, and even around the eyes. This is a part of the drawing process where I like to look back at my reference and try to see if there are any distortions. And there are multiple ways that you can do this. You can try to step back from your drawing a little bit. You can try to look at it in a mirror. Maybe that way you can see some of the more obvious distortions. Anyway, I will tend to do these smaller adjustments throughout the drawing process. I finished the ear on the right, and I'm going to be moving on to the rest of the clothes. Just a little bit more shading on the neck as well, and a few more touches on those cheekbones on the right. And I'm also going to finish the background here because I felt that I needed to make it a little bit darker and of course a little bit smoother as well. You can see that I did a bit more blending with my finger, which, like I said, is very uncommon with colored pencils, but on this surface, on this paper, it can be done, and it works. Anyway, moving on to the rest of the clothes, I'm going to do the tie now. I first put in some of the darker bits, darker lines, using a black colored pencil to establish those smaller shadows, and then I'm just going to put down this warm grey as my base color, and then on top of that I'm going to use some other colors so that I could get the color of the tie to look close to what I see in the reference. So I used that lighter warm grey for the lighter parts of the tie, and I used some raw umber and some caput mortem to modify the color of the tie a little bit. Now onto the rest of the shirt. I'm doing a bit of blending using my blending stumps and brushes, and then again putting in some shadow areas to indicate some folds in that shirt, and just fixing the edges between the shirt and the neck and the shirt and the jacket, and adding a little bit of that texture to the shirt to make that look a bit more interesting. Now I'm going to do the rest of the shirt here on the right. I started by adding a little bit more of that light grey first, and then a bit of that white on top, and then a bit more blending with a blending stump again. This way I can create these natural transitions from white areas to the areas that are not quite as white and that are just ever so slightly darker, and where I need stronger shadows I can just go back and shade a little bit with a black colored pencil or a slightly darker grey pencil. It doesn't really matter. Now I'm doing the rest of the jacket here by establishing some of the shadow areas first. Here I decided to modify the edge of the hair on the left side a little bit. I felt that it didn't stand out against the background, so I just put in a little bit more of that raw umber, and now I feel like the whole head stands out against the background a bit better. It pops out of the background, and the shape of the head looks a bit more natural and also a bit closer to what I see in the reference. I'm just going to do the rest of the jacket using the same combination of colors that I did on the left. I added a few touches of this bluish color on the shirt because I felt that blue would be a nice contrast with those brownish and orangey tones. So I added some bluish touches to the shirt and to the eyes. And now I'm going to finish the rest of the jacket using this burnt sienna and a bit of that sanguine, and then a bit of blending, and of course a bit of this darker walnut brown for some of the shadow areas, the folds, and a little bit of texture. And that should probably do it. Now I need to clean up the edges here and do a little bit more of this final shading on the background, and the drawing is almost done. I'm just going to finish these corners where the drawing was secured with a bit of tape and a bit of blending, so that I can soften that background, make it look blurry. But that's pretty much it. I'm going to put my signature here on the right side, and the drawing is done. I hope you enjoyed the drawing process. If you like my videos, please do subscribe, give me a like, comment, and of course for longer videos, more content, you can check out my Patreon, where you'll find lots of full-length narrated videos and some other stuff. Thanks for watching, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.